Give me 1 second to get this where I think I need it. Right on the line here, something like that. Whenever you're shut this. Whenever you're ready. Scene 1.
So our group had economy, which led to the American Revolution. So the basic question is, what are the economic factors that led to the American Revolution? Economic factors played a substantial role in leading colonists to spark the American Revolution. The French and Indian War left the British in debt. Therefore, laws were passed by the British Parliament, such as the Sugar Act, Townshend Act, Tea Act, and Stamp Act, which was seen as unfair and discriminatory in the eyes of the Americans, thus causing them to rebel. So the 7-Year War was a war that lasted for 7 years between 1756 and 1753. And it was pretty much that Britain had tension with Austria, Russia, and France, and that caused like all the money going towards those wars. And pretty much Britain wanted to tax the American colonies just so they could like regain like their money and stuff. And the British started to trade with other countries, and that caused a war in 1759, and the British and French fought, which ended with the British taking over Quebec. So the purpose of the 7-Year War was that it was the first real conflict between different countries, but it was the final struggle between France and Great Britain. And the French defeated George Washington in 1755, which caused a lot of debt. And the American colonists thought that they shouldn't pay, and they ended up rebelling against it. So a quote that I had was, 18th century warfare conducted on land and sea across the globe was enormously expensive. The 7-Year War put strains on all participants. The war costs produced a financial crisis in France that almost left 3 decades later would help to spark the French Revolution.
I had the Sugar Act. It was a British law passed in 1764 following the 7 Years' War. It placed a change in taxes on molasses, lowering the cost from 6 pence to 3 pence, but making sure the British were there and able to collect taxes with increased military control and presence. So my quote was, thus colonists saw the measure not as a welcome reduction in taxation, but as an attempt to get them to pay a levy that they would have otherwise evaded. Basically, the Sugar Act was a new and improved version of the Molasses Act passed in 1733. High taxes levied on molasses trade from West Indies to America, so that colonists had to buy more expensive sugar from the British. But it was stricter and decreased smuggling of goods from colonists. So the purpose was for the British to raise revenue from American colonies. After being in debt from the 7 Years' War, they thought it was only fair that Americans paid their share too. So it was also just to prevent colonists from smuggling by increasing British forces. Colonists were smuggling to avoid being taxed, and by passing the British law, they were able to control taxation more effectively with more military presence and new British Admiralty courts for tax violators, which were basically was when a British judge could decide the outcome rather than a colonial court. So the effects from the Sugar Act, it represented an economic and constitutional struggle for colonists. Americans were upset at being taxed without having a say. That's supposedly where the same taxation without representation came into play. It also impacted the rum industry because sugar and molasses were used to manufacture rum in America.
I had the Stamp Act. It was a major contributor to economics of the American Revolution. It was a British act passed in 1765, and this required that all sorts of printed material produced in the colonies carry a stamp purchased from authorities. So this included newspapers, books, court documents, commercial papers, land deeds, and almanacs. The purpose of this act was to help finance the operations of the British Empire, and it was also to help pay for stationing of the British troops in North America. The effects of this act were that it offended just about every free colonist, the rich and poor, farmers, artisans, and merchants. It was especially disliked by writers, publishers, and those who read books and newspapers. The possibility of British soldiers stationed in America alarmed many of the colonists. Many colonists were angered because they imposed this act without colonial consent. All colonial political leaders opposed the act, and the colonists eventually boycotted the act. My quote from Foner is that opposition to the Stamp Act was the first great drama of the Revolutionary era and the first major split between colonists and Great Britain over the meaning of freedom.
So my act was the Townshend Act. So basically, the Townshend Act were a series of acts that were passed in 1767. The Townshend Act forced taxes on glass, lead, paints, paper, and tea that were imported into the American colonies. The purpose of the Townshend Act was hoped that it would settle royal expenses in the colonies from the debt that was from the French and British War and Indian War, all of them. And the effects were that many Americans viewed the taxes as an abuse of British power. This resulted in the passages of agreements to limit imports from Britain, and eventually in 1770 the Parliament repealed that all Townshend Act duties except taxes on tea, and this led to a temporary truce between American colonists and the British government. The pros and cons were that the Townshend Acts allowed the British to collect more money on imports to the American colonies, but this meant that the American colonists had to spend more to get what they needed. And my quote is that the taxation of people in a province by a non-representative is illegal, and you cannot tax a person from the province without the person's consent, which basically means that the Americans felt that the British were taxing them unfairly, and they didn't have their consent or agreement, so they didn't think it was a right for the British to do this to them.
Alright, so I have the Tea Act. And so basically the British were suffering from massive amounts of debt that they owed the East India Trading Company, which was a giant trading monopoly. And so they decided to market their enormous holdings of Chinese tea in order to kind of gain back wealth. Tea was something that was consumed of all English classes. In order to spike their sales, the British offered the East India Company rebates and taxations. With this, they were able to dump low-priced tea on the American market. And this affected the colonists by undercutting merchants and smugglers who were trying to make a living. Many colonists believed that in agreeing to this act, it would further prove the British's power over the economy. And as tea shipments arrived, resistance developed in seaports, and as a result, groups of colonists disguised as Indians dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the ocean, and this became known as the Boston Tea Party. And my quote is, any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends to directly involve this continent in European wars and quarrels, and set us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship, and against whom we have neither anger nor complaint. And I said this quote relates to the relationship that Britain had with India, and that the British essentially brought the colonists into this corruption of trade and wealth.